The wind was a thief, and its trade was dust. It robbed the breath straight from Roxy Vale's chest and stole the tears before they ever reached her cheeks. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The once white silk of her wedding dress meant to seal her sail. Not her union was torn and smeared with the red dirt of the Arizona Badlands. It clung to her body like a burial shroud, a ghost of the life she'd fled. Each breath she dragged through her throat was a small rebellion against the storm, and against the man she'd left standing at the altar, built in her father's barn. Flint Red. His name tasted like grit and ash. He wasn't a suitor, he was a collector, a land baron come to claim what was owed. Her father's ranch was dying, and she at 19 was the final payment. She'd seen it in his eyes, cold, hard ownership that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with possession. He would never be kind. He would never be gentle. He'd break her like a wild mare beneath his boots. So she'd run. One heartbeat she was beside him, the preacher's droning words drowned beneath the moan of the wind. And the next, she was gone. She hiked her skirts and tore through the side door, disappearing into a wall of screaming red dust. Shouts followed, but the wind devoured them just as it tried to devour her. She had no plan, no direction, only the raw will to be free. All her life, she'd known nothing but her father Saul Vale's dying, spread a place of cracked, earth-hungry horses and empty promises. Beyond it, there was only map and myth. The nearest town, Dust Creek, was little more than a handful of buildings baking under a merciless sun. But she couldn't go there. Flint Red's reach was long, his men, his money, his temper. She had to vanish where no man would think to look. The sky was swallowed by the storm, turning day into rust-colored twilight. Roxy stumbled forward, shielding her face from the hail of sand. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled, her heart drummed like a war beat. Time lost meaning. It could have been an hour or eternity. Then the storm's song changed. The hiss of sand gave way to a low, rolling growl. Lightning ripped the sky open, spilling light across the jagged desert rocks, twisted mesquite, an endless wasteland. Then came the thunder, deep enough to rattle her bones. The first drop of rain struck her cheek like ice. Another followed. Then a flood. Within moments, dust became mud, and the wind turned from searing to freezing. The silk dress clung to her like a curse, heavy and sodden. The chill crawled into her bones, replacing panic with a numbing dread. She was going to die out here. If the cold didn't take her, the coyotes would. Just as her hope began to flicker out, she saw it a faint glow through the rain. A small golden smudge steady against the storm. A light. It could have been anyone, Flint's men bandits worse, but death in the open was certain. She clenched her jaw and staggered toward it, her bare feet sinking into the muck. A cabin emerged from the dark, rough-hewn logs, a smoking chimney fighting the wind, and beside it, a shadowed structure wide as a stable. The light came from a single dirty window. She crept closer, drenched and shaking. No horses, no wagon. A lonely man's place. This was the edge of the world, miles from anywhere. Maybe, just maybe, she was safe. She knocked. Once. Twice. The storm swallowed the sound. Her fist struck harder, knuckles splitting on splintered wood. Still nothing. Her body shook so violently she could barely stand. Desperation overrode fear. She tried the latch. Unlocked. The door swung inward, spilling her into near blackness. Heat washed over her thick, heavy air laced with smoke iron and something clean, like pine soap. The only light came from the dying orange embers in a stone fireplace, painting the room in long, restless shadows. "Hello?" she rasped, her voice raw and hollow. Nothing. Only rain hammering the roof and the fire's faint crackle. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut, cutting off the howl of the storm, her eyes strained against the dark. One cot, a wooden table, a single chair, the smell of steel and sweat. And on the far side, built right into the stone hearth, was a forge, the heart of a blacksmith's life. She was standing in the home of a man who lived by fire and solitude, and had no need for company. Her gaze caught on the heat's source, not just the faint fire in the hearth, but the great forge built right into it. The bellows lay still beside a silent anvil tools blackened and gleaming under a thin shimmer of soot. This was no cozy home. It was the dwelling of a man who lived by fire and iron. Then she saw it, a large wooden tub in the middle of the room, steam curling lazily from its surface, like ghostly breath catching the firelight. The air was thick, heavy, alive with warmth. Someone had been bathing, or still was. A jolt of raw fear shot through Roxy Vale's chest. She wasn't alone. Her hand fumbled for the door latch, heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo in her skull. But the cold and panic made her clumsy. She stumbled back, eyes darting through the shadows for any sign of movement. Her foot snagged on a rough bearskin rug. She gasped, lost her footing and fell, not onto the hard-packed dirt floor but into the scalding water. The shock ripped the breath from her lungs. Hot water, heavy silk, and God help her, the unmistakable solidity of another human body beneath her. For one stunned moment there was only silence, but for the roar of the rain. She was half submerged, sprawled awkwardly across the lap of a man, his chest a wall of muscle beneath her, his legs like stone under the clinging ruin of her dress. The soaked silk was no barrier at all. She could feel every line of him through the fabric. Her mind couldn't even process it. It was madness. A nightmare. She tried to push away, flailing helplessly, but the dress tangled her limbs and only dragged her deeper into the chaos. Another splash, another mortifying collision. She lifted her head slowly, as though the air had turned to molasses. The dim firelight revealed him. Broad shoulders, dark hair slicked back, eyes deep and steady, shocked, but calm, dark, as river rock unreadable. His face was cut from stone, shadowed by a rough beard. He wasn't old, not yet 30, but the weariness in his eyes belonged to a man who'd seen too much. And despite the absurdity of the moment, there was no anger, no threat, only disbelief. This was Jack's creed, the reclusive blacksmith who lived alone on the outskirts of Dust Creek. The ex-cavalryman whispered to have killed men and buried his ghosts beneath iron and flame, the man everyone avoided. And she, Roxy Vale, a sheltered girl who had never been held by anyone she didn't fear, had just fallen into his damn bath. Heat rose in her cheeks, hotter than the water itself. Shame and confusion swallowed her whole. She looked ridiculous, a half-drowned bride in a ruined gown draped over a stranger's bare chest. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak. I'm sorry. She stammered her words, barely audible. The storm. I tripped. Jax said nothing. He simply looked at her eyes, sweeping the absurd sight before him. His stillness was worse than anger. It was controlled, almost deliberate, like a man who'd long learned not to waste energy on panic. Without a word, He shifted, freeing her tangled legs with careful precision. No roughness, no heat, just quiet strength. Then, in one smooth motion, he rose from the tub. Water ran down his chest and arms, glinting orange in the firelight. He turned his back to her instantly. That simple, instinctive act of decency made her throat tighten. For all the rumors about him, this man did not look like a brute. He moved in the half-dark like a shadow, forged from firelight, reached for a towel, and wrapped it around his waist. Roxy sat frozen in the tub, drenched, trembling, and humiliated. The cabin smelled of smoke, pine soap, and the faint tang of steel. Her heart thudded painfully as he turned back. For a long moment he just looked at her, this shivering stranger in his bath, too scared to breathe. His expression softened just barely. Then he crossed to a narrow cot, pulled a thick wool blanket from it, and returned to her side. He held it out, his voice low and rough, the sound of a man who hadn't spoken in days. "Get out before you freeze," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was quiet, firm, and order wrapped in concern. Numbly, she obeyed. She climbed out, water streaming from her dress, pooling on the floorboards. The soaked silk clung to every curve, merciless in its honesty. She couldn't look him in the eye as she took the blanket from him. Their fingers brushed a single heartbeat of warmth that felt like lightning. She wrapped the coarse wool around her shoulders, sinking into its heat. It smelled of him, wood smoke, iron, and the clean scent of the wild outside. Jack's Creed turned back to the fireplace, adding a few small logs to the fading embers. Flames caught, throwing a steady golden light across the small room. He didn't ask who she was or what she was running from. He didn't need to. He just pointed toward the single chair by the hearth and said quietly, "Sit. Sit. Get warm." The command came low and steady, carrying more warmth than threat. Roxy Vale obeyed, her legs trembling as she crossed the few feet to the chair. She sank into it, clutching the rough wool blanket tight, pulling her feet beneath her as if she could fold herself out of sight. She watched Jack's Creed pull on a pair of worn work trousers and a linen shirt, his movements quiet, sure, almost practiced. A man used to silence, to living alone with his tools and his ghosts. Yet for all that, he hadn't thrown her back out into the rain. He didn't speak again. Instead, he moved to the cabin's small window, shoved aside the hide curtain, and looked out into the black curtain of storm. Rain hammered down like 1,000 fists on the roof, the wind howling around the cabin's seams. Jax stood there like a statue, broad, unmoving, his frame, backlit by the flicker of the fire, as if guarding his small kingdom of solitude. Behind him, the fire crackled its heat, spreading slowly into her frozen limbs. Roxy's exhaustion began to press heavier than her fear or shame. Her eyes drifted toward the shape of the blacksmith by the window, the man whose bath she had fallen into, who had given her a blanket and a fire without question. Outside, the world still howled like a beast. But in here, in this rough cabin of stone and timber, she was, if only for the moment, safe. Her head drooped, the rhythm of rain and wind lulling her under, and before she knew it, she was asleep. The first sound that pierced her dreams wasn't bird song or daylight. It was iron. A deep, ringing strike that vibrated through the chair and her bones alike. Clang. Her eyes blinked open. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Pale morning light spilled through the single window, turning dust into drifting gold. The storm was gone. Her blanket was still around her, rough but warm. The noise came again from outside this time. Roxy rose stiffly, every muscle aching from sleeping, curled in the chair. She moved to the doorway and stopped the scene before her, catching her breath. The desert had been washed clean. The red earth was dark and damp, the air sharp, with the scent of wet creosote and smoke. And there in the open workshop beside the cabin, the rust forge, stood Jack's creed. He was bare to the waist back to her, framed by the hiss and glow of his fire. Each swing of his hammer was precise, deliberate, a rhythm of strength and control. Sparks burst around him, tiny comets lighting his arms and shoulders. He was no longer just a man. He was motion and fire and will. She watched, half spellbound, half afraid. The muscles in his back rippled, with each strike, the heat shimmering around him. Then he plunged the glowing metal into water, and a roar of steam rose up between them. When the haze cleared, he turned and saw her. Their eyes met across the damp yard. His gaze was calm, unreadable, but in daylight she saw the color steel gray, like the heart of a winter storm. He didn't scowl, didn't smile. Only gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement. He wiped his forehead with a soot-blackened arm, leaving a streak across his temple. "There's coffee on the fire," he said in that same low gravel voice, "and bread on the table." Then, without waiting for an answer, he turned back to his forge. Roxy retreated inside. A small tin pot sat over the fire's embers, steam whispering from its spout. A half loaf of dark bread rested on the table. Hunger twisted inside her like a knife. She felt more ghost than woman, an intruder haunting the edges of a man's life. Her gaze fell on the heap of mud-stained silk crumpled near the hearth, her wedding dress. The sight sent a wave of humiliation through her, followed by dread. Flint Red would be looking for her by now. She could almost see his fury, his pride bleeding into rage. A man like him wouldn't forgive the humiliation. She wasn't a person in his eyes. She was property gone astray. The gossip would already be crawling through Dust Creek like snakes. Morgan's girl vanished into the storm. Did she run off? Did someone take her? The townsfolk would whisper, some with pity, most with curiosity. Her name, her worth, her reputation, all gone. She couldn't go back. And she couldn't stay here forever. Jack's creed had given her shelter from the storm. But no one, not even a man like him, could protect her from Flint Red. A cold resolve took root inside her. She would not sit idle. She would not be a burden. She drank the bitter coffee, tore a piece of bread, and forced it down despite the knot in her throat. Then she rose, found a broom made of tied twigs, and began to sweep. The floor, the corners, the ashes. She washed the tin plates by the door, and when her eyes fell on that ruined white dress again, she lifted it not as a bride mourning her gown, but as a woman who no longer needed it. She carried the ruined dress outside and hung it over a low mesquite bush. Under the morning sun, it looked less like a gown and more like a surrender flag fluttering in the breeze. Roxy Vale could feel Jack's creed's gaze on her back, a quiet, heavy awareness that followed her every movement. But he said nothing. The rhythm of his hammer never broke. When there was nothing left to tidy, the silence took over again. The cabin was stripped bare, just like the man who lived there, someone who owned little and seemed to want even less. She returned to the chair by the hearth, wrapped herself in the blanket, and let the quiet swallow her whole. The only sounds were the sharp ring of hammer on metal and the low growl of fire from late in the afternoon. The hammering stopped. Jax entered the cabin, his skin shining with sweat, streaked with soot and ash. He moved past her without a glance, grabbed a bucket of water and a rag, and washed his face and chest with brisk, practiced motions. Roxy's eyes drifted to his back, marked and scarred like a map of old pain. A deep, jagged line slashed across his left shoulder, the kind a blade leaves. Smaller, round scars freckled his right side pale and faded but unmistakable. They were soldiers' scars, the kind carved by war, the kind no one ever fully comes home from. She remembered the whispers from the Dust Creek folks, rumors told, over whiskey and gossip. Creed, the cavalryman. Fought hard, but lost something along the way. They said a lieutenant had died during a retreat, and that Jax had been the last one seen with him. There was never proof, no trial, but the word stuck like coal smoke. Killer. Now seeing the quiet, steady way he moved it seemed impossible. But the scars were there. The silence was real. He pulled on a worn gray Henley, one sleeve still torn, despite her earlier mending. His expression stayed unreadable. "Sky's clear," he said at last. Not a greeting, not an invitation. Just a fact. Roxy understood the meaning beneath it. "The storm's gone. You can leave." Her throat tightened. I can't," she whispered, voice trembling. "Not yet." He studied her, those steel gray eyes cutting through her fear, reading everything she couldn't say. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You can stay till this road's dry." His tone left no room for gratitude or argument. That was the end of it. He sat at the table, laid out a rifle, and began to clean it, his big hands careful, sure the movements mechanical, but gentle. The next days fell into a rhythm. She woke to the sound of the hammer. While he worked, she swept the cabin, fetched water from the well, and cooked what she could from his meager supplies: beans, bacon, the dark bread he seemed to live on. Once she found a small tin box with a needle and thread. She mended his torn sleeve and left it folded neatly on the cot. The next morning he was wearing it. He never mentioned it. He didn't have to. The conversation had already been stitched in place. He never asked her name, nor why she'd been running through a storm in a wedding dress. He accepted her presence the way he accepted the weather, just another thing to endure. And she, in turn, didn't ask about the scars or the ghosts behind his silence. They existed side by side, two wounded souls orbiting the same quiet space. His silence was a fortress, hers a hiding place. But the fear of Flint Red lingered like a shadow that never left her side. Every time a horse appeared on the distant ridge, Roxy froze, heart pounding until it vanished again. Jax's hammer would pause for one beat, then resume steady and grounding. The sound began to comfort her, a rhythm that reminded her she was still alive. He was a man the world called a killer, but in his quiet presence she felt more protected than she ever had before. On the third day, restless from the cabin's smoke and still air, she wandered beyond the well. The desert had begun to breathe again after the rain, small green shoots poking through the mud. Between two sun-warmed rocks, she found it a sprig of wild dead man's bloom, its violet petals trembling in the breeze, filling the air with a scent that whispered of calm and forgotten peace. She broke off a small stem and carried it home, holding it like something fragile and sacred. Inside the cabin, she looked for a place to set it, but there were no vases, no jars, nothing that hinted at softness. Her eyes fell on the wooden tub sitting empty in the center of the room, the same tub that had nearly swallowed her pride and her dignity whole. With slow, deliberate care, she placed the purple sprig on the rim. It looked out of place, delicate, in a world built of iron and ash. Yet it was her small offering, her way of saying thank you without words. A quiet apology, a gesture of grace in a place that had never known it. That evening, When Jack's Creed came back from the forge, sweat and soot streaked across his skin, he followed his routine, washed up, toweled off, turned toward the fire. Then he saw it. He froze. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the lone piece of dead man's bloom resting on the tub's edge. His hands flexed at his sides, his shoulders tight. From her chair by the fire, Roxy watched, barely breathing. She braced for him to toss it aside, to crush it like the useless weed it was. But he didn't. He simply looked at it, silent, motionless, as if the small purple flower had spoken a language he hadn't heard in years. For a fleeting moment, the hard edges of Jack's Creed's face seemed to waver. Something faint, like the ghost of a feeling, passed through his eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe a memory that refused to stay buried. The faint scent of dead man's bloom drifted through the cabin, tangled with smoke steel and the sweat of his labor. He turned back to finish washing, silent as ever. But he didn't touch the flower. He left it there. That night, as coyotes cried in the distance and the desert wind whispered through the cracks, they sat together in the soft glow of the fire. He cleaned his tools. She mended one of his socks. The silence between them was still there, but it wasn't hollow anymore. It held something unspoken, understanding, quiet gratitude, the sound of two lost souls finding a fragile rhythm. And for the first time, that silence smelled faintly sweet. The sharp tang of iron and ash had been softened by the wild scent of lavender's ghost. Roxy Vale felt the tight, icy fear in her chest begin to ease just a little. She was a woman without a name in the home of a man who carried none of his past. But for that single evening, it was enough. The peace they forged from silence and mercy lasted a week. 7 days of shared bread and quiet mornings. 7 days where she remembered how to breathe again, slow, steady, alive. But supplies ran low, and the world outside their sanctuary refused to stay forgotten. It was Jack's who finally broke the quiet, his voice rumbling over the strike of his hammer. "We're out of flour, down to our last pinch of salt." He didn't look up. His focus stayed on the red-hot iron beneath his hammer. "I can't go into Dust Creek. They keep their eyes on me there. The meaning was clear, but you can." Fear twisted in Roxy's gut. Dust Creek wasn't just a town, it was a trap. And Flint Red was the spider that owned it. Going back meant stepping right into his web. But when she glanced at Jack's, at the man who'd given her food fire and safety without question, she knew she couldn't refuse. "I'll go," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. He gave a single nod. "Then you'd best be ready." He had her change out of the tattered dress she'd foolishly kept a relic of the life that had died in the storm. Instead, he handed her a set of old dungarees and a loose linen shirt, rough and worn from years of work. With a length of rope as a belt and the sleeves rolled to her elbows, she almost looked like a ranch hand. "Keep your head down," he said, his tone firm, eyes as gray as the steel he worked. "Talk as little as possible. Go to Clay Boone's mercantile. He's not one of Red's men. Get what we need and be back before noon." He pressed a few coins into her palm, their edges warm from his hand. By the time she started down the dry wash toward town, the fear was coiled tight in her throat. Each step closer to Dust Creek made her stomach twist. When the town finally appeared, it was just as she remembered, a cluster of tired wooden buildings and wind-blown streets, worn but unyielding under the sun. Inside Boone's mercantile, the smell of coffee canvas and tobacco filled the air. She kept her hat low, moving fast flour salt, a sack of beans. Clay Boone, soft-eyed and balding, barely looked at her as she paid. Relief flooded her as she turned toward the door. She'd done it. Then a voice, slick and sharp, cut through the air. "Well, I'll be damned if it ain't one of the Vale girls." She froze. Buck Holler, the neighboring rancher, a man known for his debts and his poisonous tongue. He grinned, eyes glinting like a snake's. "Didn't figure you'd still be breathing. Red's been looking high and low for you. Says there's money in it for whoever finds his runaway bride." Roxy didn't reply. She pushed the door open and stepped into the street, her pulse slamming against her ribs. Buck's laughter followed her slick and knowing. She didn't run, but her walk back to the cabin turned into a desperate, stumbling march. When she broke through the clearing, breathless and pale, Jax was by the woodpile sharpening an axe. One look at her face, and he set the blade down. "Someone saw you." She nodded, the words tumbling out between gasps. "Buck Holler. He knew me. He said there's a reward Flint Red's offering money." Jax's face hardened, his eyes going cold as iron. He stared toward the distant ridges where Dust Creek lay, his jaw set. For a long moment, the only sound was the dry whisper of wind through the mesquite. "He'll go to Red," Jax said at last, voice flat. "They'll come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But they'll come." That night, the silence between them was different tense, loaded like a fuse, waiting for flame. The cabin felt smaller, the air heavier. Roxy stared at the fire until she finally whispered, "You should leave. They're after me, not you." Jax lifted his gaze. The firelight reflected in his eyes like the ghosts of other nights, other battles. "Running don't fix a damn thing," he said, his voice rough with truth. "It just changes where the trouble finds you." He fell quiet again, then picked up a small block of wood and began to carve it with his knife. Shavings drifted to the floor. "The men in town," he said, after a long while, his tone distant. "The ones who call me a killer, they're half right." Roxy froze, her breath caught. "I killed a man once," he went on, not looking at her. "My lieutenant," his voice lost its warmth, turning to gravel. "We were cut off in a raid. Apaches had us pinned. Lieutenant Colt Reddick took a bullet to the gut. He was dying slow, and he knew what'd happen if they took him alive." He paused, staring into the fire. "He begged me not to let them have him. Gave me an order, 'Don't let him take me, Creed.'" His hand tightened around the knife. The blade caught the light. "So I didn't. The rescue column found me about an hour later." Jax Creed said quietly. "I was still there sitting with his body when they rode up. They saw a dead officer and a living private, and they made up their own story." He stared into the fire, his voice as rough as gravel. "Said I shot him in the back to save myself. That was easier than the truth. The Army don't like stories about mercy kills." The words hung heavy in the small cabin, thick as the smoke curling toward the rafters. It was a tale of duty twisted into shame of men too cowardly to face what war really did to a man's soul. "But that ain't why I left," he added softer now. "I could have fought it, cleared my name. But I didn't give a damn anymore." He paused, the knife motionless in his hands. "Because while I was gone, while I was out there following orders, fighting for dirt, no one truly wanted my wife was killed." Roxy Vale froze, her breath catching. Wife. The word didn't belong in this quiet place among firelight and ghosts. Her name was May Crow. He said the name, leaving his lips like an old wound reopening. "We had a small homestead near the border. While I was away, a patrol came through, the Iron Riders they called themselves. Said they were looking for smugglers." He gave a humorless laugh, low and bitter. "They weren't. Just men with badges and empty souls. Thought they could take whatever they wanted." His jaw tightened, and the muscles in his forearm went rigid around the knife handle. "She stood up to him. Wouldn't let him touch what was ours. She never was afraid of men like that." He stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the fire popping in the hearth. Then his voice came again, hoarse and low. They struck her. She fell, hit her head on the stone hearth. He swallowed hard. When I came home, the fire was cold, and the only thing left was a grave the neighbor had dug. He looked up at her then, and Roxy saw it, the emptiness behind his eyes, a bottomless grief that had hollowed the man clean through. They said it was an accident, he muttered. Said she slipped. Lawmen protect their own. I learned that day there ain't no justice out here. Not from men with badges, not from men preachin' God's word. You take what you can hold. You keep what you can fight for. And when you can't hold nothing anymore, you walk away. He stared into the flames. So I did. Walked away from the army, from the law, from everything. Came out here to the edge of nowhere, where the only thing I had to answer to was the wind. In his story, Roxy heard her own echo, the same cruelty, the same injustice. Jax had been branded a killer because cowards needed someone to blame. His wife had been dismissed as another dead settler who didn't matter, just like her. Flint Red had treated her the same something to own a name, to barter away like livestock. They didn't see who you really were, she whispered, her voice trembling. Just what they wanted to believe. His gaze lifted to hers. Across the dim firelight, something passed between them, something raw and human, born of shared scars. He was no longer just her savior, and she was no longer just the woman he'd pulled out of a storm. They were both survivors haunted by what the world had taken. By morning, the air between them had changed. The fear was still there, but the hopelessness was gone, replaced by something hard and steady. Red will come, Jax said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. And he'll bring men. You can't just hide from that. He took her outside to the small yard beside the rust forge, where an old chest sat half-buried in dust. From it, he drew a heavy peacemaker revolver, its blued steel dulled by time. You need to know how to use this, he said simply, pressing it into her hands. He showed her how to load the cartridges, how to pull the hammer back slow, how to aim. Her hands shook. The gun felt heavier than she expected, like it carried the weight of choice. Now breathe, he said. The first shot cracked through the morning stillness echoing across the desert. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and the bullet kicked up dust 10 feet wide of the target. Again was all he said. Day after day they practiced. He taught her patience, the rhythm of breath, the quiet between heartbeats. Don't fight the gun, he told her. Let it work with you. Her fear of the weapon faded, replaced by something else control. The gun wasn't evil. It was survival. And it was hers now. He didn't just teach her to shoot. He taught her the land, the tracks of coyote and deer, the way to find water by following the cottonwoods, how to vanish among rock and sage if she ever needed to run. One afternoon, he led her to the small lean-to stable beside the forge. Inside stood a black mare, her coat gleaming like oil despite the bandaged leg she favored. The animal's dark eyes watched them warily. What happened to her? Roxy asked softly, drawn to the creature's quiet pain. Rockslide Jax answered, crouching beside her to change the bandage. Found her up in the canyon a month back. Leg was bad, figured I'd have to put her down. But she's tougher than she looks. He patted the mare's neck gently. Her name's Gunpowder. The name brought the faintest smile to Roxy's lips. It was something alive, something to care for. She began spending her afternoons in the stable, talking to the horse in soft tones, brushing her coat until it shimmered. She cleaned the wound carefully, just as he'd shown her. At first, Gunpowder flinched from her touch. But over time, the mare began to trust her, pressing her nose against Roxy's shoulder, breathing slow and warm. Jax would watch from the doorway, his shadow long in the sunlight. He saw the ease in her movements, the gentle confidence in her hands, the quiet strength she didn't know she carried. And for the first time in years, he realized the silence around him didn't feel empty anymore. Gunpowder's trust hadn't come easily, not to Jack's creed, and not to anyone. But as the days rolled by, something in that wounded mare began to change. And so did Roxy Vale. She learned to hold her ground, to steady her hands on a revolver, instead of trembling around it, to read the desert's moods like scripture, the way shadows moved, how wind told direction, how stillness whispered danger. And as she grew stronger, the mare healed too. The limp eased. The dull fear faded from her dark eyes, replaced by a quiet fire. Gunpowder's slow return to strength mirrored Roxy's own, both battered things mending under the same brutal sun. One evening, as the sky bled into a wild sunset of rust and violet, Roxy led the mare on a slow loop around the yard. Gunpowder's steps were steady now, her head high, her spirit alive again. From the doorway of the rust forge, Jax stood watching not the horse, but her. The firelight behind him burned his outline in gold, his shoulders broad, his stance still and sure. His eyes held no pity now, only a deep, quiet respect. Something broken in him was healing too. The desert's calm that night was its most dangerous lie. The air wasn't silent. It was full of a low, living rhythm. Crickets trilling, an owl crying far off, the dry whisper of wind through sagebrush. Inside the cabin was warm and still heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the fading trace of dead man's bloom. Roxy sat by the fire, mending a grain sack with careful, neat stitches. Across from her, Jax was oiling his rifle, each motion slow and practiced. The waiting had stretched into weeks. Every creak of timber, every gust outside could have been the start of something. They weren't at peace. They were braced. Then the desert went still. The crickets stopped. The owl went mute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The sudden void pressed against their ears, heavy as a held heartbeat. Jax looked up sharply, his eyes meeting hers across the table. He didn't need to say a word. In one swift motion, he blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The fire's embers glowed faintly, painting his face in shifting amber. Down, he whispered. His voice was low, but commanding. He nudged her gently to the floor behind the thick wooden table, then moved to the window, his shadow a tense silhouette rifle in hand. Then came the sound, hooves. Not the wild thunder of a chase, but the slow, deliberate gait of men who knew exactly where they were headed. Predators. A voice followed, slick, venomous, and far too familiar, Creed. "I know you're in there." The name struck like a stone in Roxy's gut. She flattened herself against the packed earth, her heart racing. The Colt he'd given her felt impossibly heavy in her belt. "I've come for what's mine," the man called again, smug and cold. "Flint red. Send out the girl, and maybe I'll let you live," he sneered. "She's my property, and I don't take kindly to thieves." Jax didn't answer. He waited still as a statue, every nerve tuned to the night. The only sound was the low creak of saddle leather, the faint jingle of reins, and a cruel laugh somewhere in the dark. Red's tone sharpened, the false civility vanishing. "You want to play hard, Creed? Fine. I'll burn you out." A moment later, the night bloomed orange. Fire roared to life, devouring the forge. Flames climbed the dry timber with a scream, turning the workshop into a torch that painted the desert blood red. One of Red's riders, silhouetted against the blaze, tossed another burning brand onto the roof. The fire caught with a deafening crack, sparks spilling into the black sky. Heat slammed into the cabin walls. Smoke slithered through the gaps in the wood, choking and thick. At the cabin next, Creed Red's voice bellowed through the chaos. They were trapped. The fire would drive them out, or the guns outside would finish the job. Jax made his choice without hesitation. "Stay here," he said tightly, already moving. "Wait." She started, but he was gone, kicking the door open and disappearing into the burning night. Through the haze and the heat, the world broke into flashes, firelight, shadow, gunfire. She saw him, Jax Creed, a lone figure cutting through smoke and chaos with the calm, lethal precision of a soldier who'd long since made peace with death. He ducked behind the stone well, firing in measured bursts. Each shot cracked like thunder. A man fell from his saddle. Another dropped, screaming into the dust. Then the night answered back, bullets chewing through the doorframe, slamming into the log walls around her. Roxy pressed her hands over her ears, trembling, the noise deafening. But she forced herself to look. He was still standing, still fighting. A ghost in the firelight. His rifle barked again. Another of Red's men went down. And then she saw him. Flint Red himself. He was on foot now, crouched behind a horse, shouting orders. His face was hard and calm, his rage hidden behind that cold, calculating stare. He wasn't just a brute. He was leading them like a general in his own private war. Jax was reloading by the well when she saw movement behind him, a figure creeping through the firelight, pistol raised, ready to strike from behind. Her pulse spiked. Jax. She screamed the name, ripping from her throat, raw and terrified. Jax Creed spun at the sound, but it was too late. The gun flashed a harsh, flat crack that tore the night apart. The bullet hit him square in the side. His cry was raw, guttural, the sound of pain he refused to give in to. His rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered against the stones. He staggered, one hand pressed to the wound, blood already seeping through his fingers. The shooter stepped forward, smug and certain of victory, while Flint Red emerged from behind his horse like a vulture from the smoke, his pistol drawn, his cold eyes fixed on the wounded man. This was it. They meant to finish him and take her. Something inside Roxy Vale broke open. Fear was still there, screaming in the back of her mind, but it was buried beneath something stronger. Memory. The sound of Jax's voice when he'd told her about May Crow, the quiet steadiness in his eyes when he'd handed her the revolver. He had seen her as human when the world had not. She would not let him die. Her hand found the Colt on her belt. It felt impossibly heavy, her fingers shaking so bad she could hardly close them around the grip. She heard his voice in her head, calm, measured the one thing that could cut through chaos. Control your breath. Don't yank the trigger. Squeeze. She rose from behind the table, heart hammering so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and acrid. Outside, the fire roared like a living thing. Flint Red and his gunmen were focused on Jax, their backs turned. Roxy raised the gun in both hands, arms trembling, sight darting between the men, and then she saw it. The oil lantern hanging from a post near the well, its glow barely visible through the haze. That was her chance. She aimed not at the men but at the light. Drew in a breath, held it, and squeezed. The revolver roared like thunder. The kick slammed into her palms, the sound deafened her, and for a moment she thought she'd missed until the lantern shattered in a burst of fire and glass. Burning oil sprayed outward. The small pool of light vanished, plunging the yard into chaos. The men cursed and spun around, momentarily blinded. It was all the opening they'd get. Even wounded Jax moved like lightning. He lunged not at the enemy, but back toward her. His hand locked around her arm, iron strong, even as blood dripped down his fingers. "Run," he rasped. Then he shoved her ahead of him, dragging her into the dark behind the cabin. They sprinted through the smoke and the shouting toward the lean-to, where Gunpowder reared and screamed in panic. The mare's eyes were wide, her muscles straining against the tether. Jax didn't waste a second. He slashed the rope free, gritted his teeth through the pain, and vaulted onto her bare back. His breath hitched as he grabbed for Roxy, hauling her up into the saddle in front of him. "Go!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with fire and blood. He drove his heels into Gunpowder's sides, and the mare surged forward, powerful and sure-footed even in the chaos. They broke through the burning yard through gunfire and the furious screams of Flint Red and into the open desert. Wind tore at Roxy's hair. Smoke clawed at her lungs, but she didn't look back. Behind her she could feel Jax's weight, heavy against her, his arm around her waist, slackening. Something warm and wet soaked through her shirt, his blood. He mumbled directions, his voice fading. "The hills. Follow the dry creek bed." Gunpowder ran, as if she understood the stakes, swift and fearless through the labyrinth of rock and shadow. The world behind them burned, and still they rode. By the time the first light of dawn bled across the horizon, they had reached a massive red cliff, its face rising like a fortress. Jax stirred weakly, pointing. There he gasped toward a narrow crack hidden by scrub oak. Roxy slid down from the horse, her knees buckling under her. She helped him dismount, his full weight collapsing against her small frame. "Come on," she whispered, breath ragged. "Just a little farther." They stumbled into this crevice and fell into the dim shelter of a hidden cave. Jax hit the ground hard breath, leaving him in a painful hiss. His shirt was soaked through the blood, spreading dark and wide across his ribs. Panic surged in her chest, but she pushed it down. He had fought for her. Now she would fight for him. She tethered Gunpowder in the brush outside, then tore through his gear until she found the canteen. She needed bandages. She ripped a strip from the shirt he'd given her. Not enough. She tore another from her own. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely tie the cloth. When she peeled his blood-soaked shirt away, she saw the wound, a jagged hole, just above his hip, deep and ugly, but not yet fatal. She had no antiseptic, no medicine. Only water. Then she remembered. The scrap of cloth in her pocket, the one she'd once wrapped around a sprig of deadman's bloom. She pulled it free, unfolded it with shaking fingers. The faint scent of lavender still clung to it. She poured water over it and pressed it to the wound. The fragrance drifted up, mingling with the harsh metallic tang of blood, the ghost of peace amid the ruin of battle. And there, in the dim gray light of dawn, Roxy Vale pressed her shaking hands against his wound and whispered, "Don't you dare leave me now, Creed." Roxy Vale pressed the strip of cloth tight against the wound, her hands trembling but steady enough to hold back the flow of blood. Her touch was soft, careful, as if gentleness alone might keep him tethered to life. Jax Creed flinched, a low groan escaping between his clenched teeth. His eyes fluttered open, clouded and unfocused, trying to find her through the darkness. "Roxy." He breathed her name more a plea than a word. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking though no tears fell. "I'm right here. Don't move." For the first time since she'd stumbled into his world, the man who had stood unyielding against fire, blood, and loss lay helpless before her. The one who had shielded her from harm now depended entirely on her shaking hands. The girl who once ran from a wedding, who'd been frightened by her own shadow, was now the one fighting to keep death itself at bay. She pressed harder on the makeshift bandage, her small frame leaning over him protectively as the darkness of the cave pressed in around them. Outside night had hidden them, but in here the darkness was alive. It swallowed light, muffled breath, devoured sound. Only the faint rasp of Jax's shallow breathing broke the suffocating stillness. The cold stone beneath them bit through her clothes, but the heat radiating from his body burned hotter with every passing moment. The bleeding had slowed, but a fever had come creeping in like a silent thief. His skin, once clammy and pale, was now burning. His breath came shallow and fast, and his face glistened with sweat. The fire that once belonged to his forge now raged within him. He began to mutter, voice thick with delirium. Broken words tumbled out, ghostly fragments from another life. "Hold the line! Steady now! Men by the river." His words were the echoes of a soldier lost on some battlefield only he could see. Then his fever dream shifted. His voice softened, grew ragged, trembling with a pain that no bullet could inflict. "May," he whispered, "check the well, the fence before the rains come." The name struck Roxy like a physical blow. May Crow. His wife. Her heart clenched as he spoke to a woman long dead, trapped in some memory he couldn't escape. His head turned weakly against the stone floor, his hands clutching at the air as if reaching for someone who wasn't there. "I should have been there," he rasped, voice cracking. "I'm sorry, May. I'm so damn sorry." Each word cut her to pieces. It wasn't just pity that flooded her. It was something sharper, something she didn't want to name. Jealousy, longing, the ache of hearing love in his voice for someone else, a ghost who still owned a part of him she never could. But he was alive, and he was hers to save now. Whatever haunted him, whatever ghosts whispered his name in the dark, she would not let them take him. "Stay with me," she murmured, brushing the sweat from his forehead. "Please, Jax, don't you dare leave me now." Desperate, she rummaged through his leather satchel, hoping for something, anything that might help. Her fingers brushed cold metal, a box of cartridges, a sharpening stone, and then something different, small, hard, and bound in leather. A book. She pulled it free. It was a pocket Bible, its black cover worn soft from years of handling. The gold lettering on its spine had long since faded. Inside the front cover, in elegant handwriting, was a name, May Crow. Beneath it, a date, 6 years old. Roxy stared at the inscription, her heart twisting. This was the last piece of the woman he had loved. She was not a woman of faith. The desert had taught her to pray for rain, not for redemption. But holding that little book, she felt something stir a weight, a comfort, a promise she didn't quite understand. She opened it to the middle, to a passage that felt familiar even to someone who hadn't set foot in a church in years. The Psalms, words of the weary and the wounded. Angling the book toward a faint shaft of moonlight seeping through the crack in the cave wall, she began to read. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered. "I shall not want." Her words trembled in the air, soft as wind through dry grass. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Jax's thrashing slowed. His breathing evened just a little, the fever's fury easing under the sound of her voice. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she continued, her tone gaining strength. "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Her throat burned. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop. She kept reading through the night, verse after verse. Her voice, the only sound in the darkness, fighting back despair. One breath, one word, one prayer at a time. And though she couldn't see the sun rise outside, She knew that somehow it was coming. The words became her anchor, not only saving Jack's creed, but saving Roxy Vale herself. Each verse echoed against the stone walls, wrapping them both in a fragile cocoon of sound. She was no longer a terrified runaway clutching at hope in the dark. She had become a keeper of the light, a guardian of what little life still flickered in him. The fever raged hardest before dawn in that cursed hour, when night is deepest and the world holds its breath. Jax's body went rigid, a violent tremor seizing him. His breath hitched short, shallow, terrifyingly weak. "No," she whispered, panic sharpening her voice. "No, you don't. Not now." She fumbled for the canteen, her hands shaking as she uncapped it. Pouring the last of their water onto the blood-stiffened scrap that still carried the scent of dead man's bloom, she pressed it to his face, his neck, his wrists. Her touch was desperate, her words a litany. "Stay with me, Creed. Stay with me, you stubborn fool." For a long, endless moment, he didn't answer. He lay motionless, the heat of the fever fading into an awful stillness. Roxy slumped beside him, her strength gone, despair closing in like the cave walls. She bowed her head and let the silence crush her. Then came the faintest shudder, not the convulsions of fever, but a deep, trembling chill. His body, once burning like a forge, was cooling now. The fire had broken. His breath deepened, uneven, but steadying. She laid her head against his chest, and there it was, the slow, strong beat of his heart. The most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The long, terrible night had passed. When dawn crept through the narrow crack above Jax, Creed stirred. His eyes blinked open to a world painted in gray and gold. Pain crossed his face, but awareness returned, slow, cautious. He tried to sit up, gasped, and fell back. "What?" His voice was a rasp of sandpaper and regret. "The fever's gone," she said softly. "You're safe. You've been burning up all night." He exhaled, closing his eyes as memory crashed over him, the fire, the gunfight, the escape, fragments of dreams, voices calling from the past. And then he remembered her name. May. The word scraped from his throat. He turned his face away. Shame etched deep into every line. "You heard me," he murmured. Roxy understood. It wasn't just the fever he meant, it was the ghosts, the things he'd said that weren't meant for anyone living to hear. She reached out, resting her cool palm against his forehead. "I heard a man in pain," she said quietly. "A man who loved his wife. A man who's carried too much alone." He looked at her, then his gray eyes haunted. "They call me a killer," he said hoarsely. "I took a man's life, Roxy." She met his gaze without flinching. "I know what folks in Dust Creek say. I've heard the stories. But that's not the man sitting in front of me." Her voice was low, steady. "You gave me shelter when you didn't have to. You taught me how to stand my ground. You fought for me. That's who you are, Creed, not the sinner they whisper about." Her words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. For years he had lived behind walls built from guilt and silence, convinced he deserved every cruel word the world threw his way. Yet here she was, this fragile, fierce woman, who'd once been lost herself, looking at him and seeing something worth saving. It felt like absolution. At that moment, the sun rose, fully spilling a beam of gold through the split in the rock. Dust motes danced like tiny embers drifting through the light. The warmth brushed their faces, chasing away the last chill of the night. It caught the tear tracks on Roxy's cheeks, and the quiet wonder in Jack's Creed's eyes as the first true morning of their new life began. It was the kind of sunrise the desert saved for its survivors, soft gold and full of quiet mercy. The fever had passed. The ghosts had gone still. For the first time in what felt like years, Roxy Vale and Jack's Creed sat in the light of a new day, breathing as two souls who had clawed their way back from the edge. They didn't need scripture or salvation, just each other. News came drifting to them on a stray wind days later, carried by a weary preacher who'd lost his way in the painted hills. Reverend Gage looked half-starved, dust crusted into the seams of his coat. His eyes wide with the haunted look of a man who'd stumbled into something he wasn't meant to see. He brought a story one already taking root in Dust Creek legend. Flint Red was dead. The preacher didn't know much, only what the saloon talk had decided was truth. After the raid on the Rust Forge, Red and his men had ridden back into town empty-handed and seething. A bottle too many a bounty, unpaid a quarrel over silver that turned to lead. Guns were drawn. When the smoke cleared, Flint Red lay face down in the dirt, shot by the same man he'd once trusted, Buck Holler. The one who'd recognized Roxy at the forge hadn't survived either. The law, brutal, cold, and efficient, had cleaned up the mess in its own way. The danger that had chased them into the hills was gone, but going back meant facing another kind of storm. When they finally rode toward Dust Creek, they weren't victors returning home. They were two shadows moving through the stillness, her in front, him behind gunpowder's hooves, a steady rhythm against the earth. The land bore its scars. The forge was a black skeleton against the horizon, nothing but charred beams and ash. Only the anvil stood unbroken, dark with soot, but solid like a relic of stubborn endurance. The cabin had survived, though the walls carried the story in their bullet holes. Roxy turned to look at Jax, expecting grief or maybe anger. Instead, she saw something else entirely. Resolve. His gaze lingered on the wreckage, then shifted to her. "I'll need an axe," was all he said. And just like that, they began again. It was slow work, sweat, grit, and quiet determination. No gunfire, no grand heroics, just two people rebuilding a life, splinter by splinter. They hauled the ruined timber away, gathered new wood from the creekside pines. Jax, with that quiet, deliberate strength that defined him, showed her how to notch the logs, how to brace them. Her hands blistered, her shoulders burned, but her heart was steady. From a distance, the townsfolk watched. At first with suspicion, then curiosity. They saw the so-called killer and the runaway girl working side by side from dawn to dusk, saying little, moving in perfect rhythm. The steady thud of hammer and saw became the new heartbeat of Dust Creek. Whispers softened. Eyes that once judged began to lower. Then came the offerings, humble, wordless peace offerings left by dawn, a sack of potatoes, a coil of rope, a jar of preserves. Silent apologies left on their fence line. Jax would find them each morning, nod once toward the town, then go back to work. The silence between him and Roxy had changed too. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full. A shared language made of small gestures and wordless care. She knew when to hand him the right tool before he even asked. He'd pour her a dipper of water before she realized she was thirsty. Their connection was quiet, natural, and strong as iron cooling under flame. By late summer, the Rust Forge had risen again, its pine walls fresh, its roof tight, its anvil back in its place. Hope clung to the scent of new wood and smoke. That evening when the sun turned the world to amber, Roxy watched Jax standing in the doorway of the new forge. He was coated in soot, shirt clinging to his back, hair damp with sweat, but there was pride in his eyes. For the first time, the weight of the past seemed to loosen its hold. As he tended the last of the fire, she slipped quietly back to the cabin. Her body ached, but her heart was sure. Tonight she wouldn't wait for him to take care of her. She would take care of him. She hauled bucket after bucket from the well, heating each one over the hearth until steam filled the room. The old wooden tub, the same one where their paths had first collided, stood waiting. When the water was ready, she poured it in, watching the steam rise like ghosts finally set free. And in that small, warm cabin, Roxy Vale prepared the simplest of gifts, a moment of peace, for the man who had fought his way back to life beside her. She added a sliver of pine soap, the kind Jax Creed always favored. Its sharp, resin-sweet scent filled the air, clinging to the rising steam. She was rebuilding a memory. But this time it wouldn't end in shock or shame. This time it would be a choice. Roxy Vale moved carefully deliberate in every motion. She laid out a clean towel, the good one, and set it beside the tub. The fire crackled low, bathing the room in amber light. When she finally stepped back to look at what she'd done, the cabin felt different. Warmer, softer. The door creaked open. Jax stood there, broad shoulders heavy with exhaustion, his shirt blackened by soot. He froze in the doorway, the scene before him, stealing his breath, the steaming bath, the folded towel, the quiet woman standing by the hearth, her face glowing in firelight. Their eyes met. She didn't speak, only offered a faint, knowing smile. It was all the invitation he needed. He didn't ask questions. Didn't pretend he wasn't tired down to his bones. Slowly, he unlaced his boots, stripped away the dirt-stiff clothes of the day, and stepped into the steaming water. A long sigh escaped him, low, deep, and grateful, as the heat soaked into his worn muscles. Roxy turned away to give him privacy, but the air between them was charged with something new, something wordless, and alive. The man who had once been her protector now rested in her care. For the first time, she was the one offering shelter. After a while, when the splashing quieted and his breathing steadied, she turned back. Jax leaned against the edge of the tub, eyes closed, the weight of a lifetime of struggle melting from his face. She walked to the mantel, took down a small jar, and from it drew a single sprig of dead man's bloom lavender she had picked that morning. She laid it gently on the rim of the tub beside his calloused hand. The soft, floral scent rose through the steam, weaving through the sharper pine, filling the cabin with something almost holy. His eyes opened. He looked at the small bloom resting near his fingers, then at her. He reached out, brushing it with rough fingertips that had once shaped steel and stone and now touched something far more delicate. His gaze lifted to hers. And in that moment, every wall he had built inside himself came tumbling down. He saw it clearly now, the wild, trembling girl who'd once fallen into his life like a storm had become the woman who rebuilt it piece by piece. The first time she had tumbled into his bath by accident, a frightened angel crashing through his solitude. Tonight she had brought the bath to him intentionally, gently turning chaos into peace. She wasn't May Crow, and she wasn't meant to be. She wasn't a ghost or a replacement for loss. She was Roxy Vale, the woman who had saved his life with trembling hands and steady courage, the woman who had chosen him not out of fear, but out of love. One sprig of lavender at a time. His voice came low and rough, thick with emotion. That scent. he said barely more than a whisper. I found it once and I'll never lose it again. He wasn't just talking about the flower. Roxy's breath caught her heart tightening as she understood. I found you once by accident, his eyes seemed to say. Now I've found you by choice, and I'll keep choosing you. A tear slid down her cheek, but she smiled through it. It wasn't sorrow, it was something clean, something whole. That night wasn't about scrubbing away the soot of the day. It was baptism, two weary souls washed clean of blood, ash, and sorrow. When dawn finally broke, the light through the window felt softer somehow. The world outside hadn't changed, the same rugged hills, the same thin air, but something between them had. The silence that once carried unease now held peace. When the hammer began to ring from the rust forge, its sound was no longer a lonely defiance against ghosts. It was steady, rhythmic, alive. Still, life couldn't be lived entirely at the edge of the wilderness. They needed food, tools, and supplies, which meant returning to Dust Creek, the very town that had once cast them out. And so one clear morning, Roxy Vale and Jax Creed saddled Gunpowder and rode toward the town, not as fugitives or outcasts, but as two people unafraid to face whatever waited on the other side of the horizon. They rode into Dust Creek on Gunpowder, the morning sun burning low over the roofs. Jax Creed held the reins, and Roxy Vale sat behind him, her hands resting lightly at his waist. When the horses' hooves struck the main street, the sound echoed through the silence that fell like a curtain. Men stopped mid-sentence on the boardwalks. Women froze in doorways. Curtains fluttered with unseen faces peering out. It was the quiet of a town watching a legend return from the dead. Their first stop was Clay Boone's Mercantile. Boone, once too proud to even look Roxy in the eye, now stood behind the counter pale and speechless. He nodded stiffly to Jax, measuring out flour and coffee with trembling hands. When they turned to leave, Della Boone stepped out from the back room. She didn't look at Jax. She looked straight at Roxy. "Your stitching on that boy's shirt was mighty fine," she said, her voice calm but clear enough for everyone in the shop to hear. "My youngest tore her Sunday dress. If you've got the time, I'll pay you fair to mend it." It wasn't just an offer, it was a truce. A bridge built woman to woman, quiet and honest. "I'd be glad to," Roxy answered, her voice steady. Her chin lifted just enough to show she meant it. That small exchange was the first crack in the wall Dust Creek had built around them. Roxy mended the dress with such skill that the tear vanished like it had never been. Della paid her well, and more importantly, showed her neighbors the work. Soon, women began to appear at the cabin door with armfuls of mending ripped dungarees, torn sleeves, dresses that had seen too many washings. They stayed for tea or just a few quiet minutes of talk. The fear in their eyes faded, replaced by something softer. Roxy set up a small work table by the window, a basket for her spools, and a view of the forge outside where Jax worked. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running, she was building. She wasn't the runaway or the blacksmith's woman. She was Roxy Vale, seamstress of Dust Creek. Jax's road back into the town's good graces was longer. The men respected his strength but still kept their distance, wary of the stories whispered over whiskey. That changed one blistering afternoon when a rider from the Cross T Ranch tore into town. One of their best cutting horses had tangled itself in barbed wire, the wound deep and bleeding out. They were ready to put it down when someone remembered the old rumor Creed was cavalry once. Without hesitation, Jax packed his tools and linen rolls onto Gunpowder and rode hard. He returned long after dark, weary and red to the elbows with someone else's blood. He said nothing, but the rancher did. By morning, every man in the saloon had heard how Jack's creed had worked with the calm of a surgeon and the hands of a smith cleaning and stitching the wound, binding it with a splint made from a whiskey barrel stave. The horse lived. After that, they came quietly, one by one. A farmer with a lame mule. A logger with an axe wound. A mother with a child burning up from fever. Jax never called himself a doctor, but his knowledge shaped by battlefields and hard years was worth more than any medicine peddler. He took no coin, but found sacks of flour, salted meat, and tools waiting at his door. Soon the rhythmic clang of the rust forge became the heartbeat of Dust Creek. It rang at dawn, carrying across the valley a sound not of anger, but of life returning. Men gathered outside the forge, waiting for repairs, swapping stories, passing tobacco. They didn't speak of the past. They didn't need to. The present was being forged one strike at a time. One afternoon, Roxy watched from her sewing table as Jax shod a horse for a farmer. His movements were sure, strong, graceful. The farmer's little boy stood close, eyes wide. Noticing Jax, took a scrap of iron, heated it until it glowed and shaped it into a tiny horseshoe. When he handed it to the boy, the child's face lit up with unfiltered wonder. Roxy's throat tightened. In that single moment, she saw the last of his ghosts fall away. Jack's creed was no longer surviving. He was living. Their days fell into a steady rhythm, him at the forge, here at her sewing. Nights belonged to quiet comfort reading, talking, sometimes just sitting by the fire with their hands intertwined. He'd reach over, rough fingers curling around hers, and that simple touch said more than words ever could. The cabin changed too. Roxy sewed curtains for the window, a patchwork rug for the floor. Jax built her a proper sewing table, shelves for her cloth, and a bed wide, sturdy, smooth. It wasn't just a place to rest anymore. It was a home. One evening, Clay Boone stopped by with a gift, an old, unused ledger from the store. "Reckon you could use this," he said. Its pages were clean, waiting to be filled. That night, after Jack's creed had fallen asleep beside her, the fire still flickering low, Roxy Vale opened the ledger to its first blank page. She dipped her pen in ink, the scent of dead man's bloom, still faint in the room, and began to write not of fear or flight, but of beginnings. Roxy Vale listened to the slow rhythm of Jack's creed's breathing beside her. Steady, strong, a sound that anchored her to the present. She lit the small oil lamp, its flame flickering soft against the cabin walls, and opened the old ledger Clay Boone had given her. Dipping her pen into ink, she began to write. She wrote of dust storms and narrow escapes, of the day she'd stumbled into his bath, half wild and frightened, of fire and fever, of the cave that had become their refuge. She wrote of the clang of his hammer, the rough warmth of his hand closing around hers, and the rare, unguarded smile that had changed everything. But she wasn't simply telling their story, she was mapping her rebirth, making sense of the wild, impossible path that had led her here. Her gaze lifted to the man sleeping peacefully beside her, to the faint glow of the rust forge outside the window. Its outline was dark but solid under the wide desert sky. The fire that Flint Red had set to destroy them hadn't ended their story. It had begun it. The blaze had burned away everything false, leaving only truth, two souls tempered by heat and hardship, forged into something new. She dipped her pen again, the scratch of ink echoing in the quiet. In her mind, she still heard that steady clang, clang, clang from earlier that day, not the lonely rhythm of survival, but the heartbeat of renewal. Her pen moved with certainty across the page, "We build not to forget the fire," she wrote, "but to remember that we survived it." Outside, autumn had crept quietly into Dust Creek. The air carried the smell of dry grass and faint wood smoke, the scent of endings and rest. The hammer that had once rung from dawn to dusk now paused earlier in the day, its echoes replaced by silence. Not emptiness, but peace, a silence earned. That evening, when the last light faded from the hills, Jax stepped out of the forge, wiping his hands on a rag. The day's work was finished. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the ease of a man who no longer fought ghosts. At the cabin door, Roxy met him, with a dipper of cool well water. He drank deeply, his eyes lifting to hers, over the rim, that small, wordless question between them. "Are you ready?" She smiled and nodded. No words were needed. Lately they'd taken to walking in the evenings, not out of necessity, but ritual. A slow, quiet journey to the river beyond the far edge of the property, where the world seemed to fall away. It was how they left the labor of the day behind, trading the clang of iron for the murmur of water and wind. They walked side by side, their shoulders brushing now and then. They didn't need to hold hands. The closeness between them was a living thing, invisible, yet felt in every shared breath. The trail had become familiar underfoot, a narrow line through the sage and creosote, worn by their own footsteps. Roxy noticed every change in the land, now the cottonwoods turning gold, their leaves trembling like coins in the twilight, the soft roll of the hills glowing in silver light, the cry of a hawk circling high above. This land, once cruel and alien, was now her home. She knew its scents, its silences, the feel of the wind shifting before a storm. The wild desert no longer threatened her. It spoke to her. They reached their place by the river, a scatter of smooth stones, still warm from the sun. The water moved slow and glassy, reflecting the vastness of the sky. As the last sunlight slipped behind the hills, the river turned to silver, holding the dying light, as if reluctant to let it go. They sat together, saying nothing. Words would have only broken the spell. Roxy watched the water and thought about the girl she had been, the one who'd run terrified through the storm, her heart full of panic and shame. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned the truer meaning of survival. It wasn't just endurance, it was rebuilding quietly, patiently, until you belonged to the world again. Beside her, Jax sat watching the river, his strong frame at ease. She wondered what he saw reflected there, the ghosts of war and loss perhaps. But the man beside her now was not the haunted soldier she'd met. The walls around him had come down brick by stubborn brick. His laughter, that deep, rough sound, came more easily now. The shadows still lingered in his eyes, but they no longer ruled him. He had made space for light. For her. Reaching into the small cloth pouch tied at her belt, Roxy drew out a sprig of dried, dead man's bloom, the same hardy plant she had found months ago by the creek. Its purple had long faded, but the scent, faint and sweet, still lingered. She held it between her fingers, smiling softly. That flower had once been a desperate offering. Now it was a symbol of everything they had built, a memory preserved, a promise made real. The fire meant to destroy them had in the end forged them both. With a slow, effortless motion, Roxy Vale lifted the sprig of dead man's bloom and tucked it into the knot of honey gold hair at the nape of her neck. It wasn't an act of vanity. It was a quiet declaration of who she was now. That wildflower had carried her story, their story, through fire and ash, through silence and storms. Jack's creed turned his head toward her. He'd seen her do that before, but under the river's silver light the gesture seemed sacred, like the whole weight of their journey was tied up in that one small movement. He watched her face in profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the strength written in her jaw. She wasn't the frightened stranger the rain had thrown into his life anymore. She was the woman who had fought her way through fear and loss and come out the other side scarred maybe, but unbroken. She had brought light and scent and color back into his world of soot and solitude. She had been the one mistake that had put everything right. "The river carried you to me by accident," he said at last, his voice quiet, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. He didn't mean the gentle current at their feet, but the other river, the one of chaos and chance that had swept her from her old life and left her trembling and rain-soaked at his door. It wasn't a line meant to charm. It was simply truth. Roxy turned toward him, a slow smile softening her features. His words settled deep inside her, resonating with something she hadn't known how to name. Everything before that night had been a straight road someone else had drawn for her, a narrow, suffocating path toward a future she hadn't chosen. Running had been madness. The wrong thing, the reckless thing. But that single wrong step had been the first true one she'd ever taken. It had led her here to him, to peace to herself. She smiled wider, the reflection of the dying silver light glinting in her eyes. Then that mistake, she said softly, was the only thing that ever made sense. His hand found hers in the cool air. His rough fingers threaded through hers, steady and sure. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, a vow without words, a promise sealed in silence. They sat like that for a long time, as twilight deepened. The last streaks of silver drained from the river, replaced by starlight, shimmering in the slow current. The desert night began to sing around them, the chirr of crickets, the lonely cry of a coyote drifting on the wind. Those sounds, once sharp with danger, now felt like the heartbeat of home. When they finally rose and started back toward the cabin, the horizon was a sweep of violet shadow. In the distance, a single golden glow shone from their window, a small, steady beacon against the endless dark. It was their light, their home, their future, built not from chance or fate, but from a single stubborn act of survival that had turned out to be grace. The faint scent of dead man's bloom followed them all the way back, sweet, lingering, eternal. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.